Problem number 3. Powdered milk is packed in a 1 kilogram bag. An inspector from the Department of Trade and Industry, or DTI, suspects that the bag may not contain 1 kilogram. A sample of 40 bags produces a mean of 0.96 kilograms and a standard deviation of 0.12 kilogram. Is there enough evidence to conclude that the bags do not contain 1 kilogram as stated at alpha level equal to 0.05? First step is to identify the null and alternative hypotheses. If you can remember, the null and alternative hypothesis is already identified for this given problem during the discussion for test of hypotheses. So, we'll just copy the null and alternative hypothesis from that lesson. The null hypothesis is population mean is equal to 1 kilogram, and the alternative hypothesis is population mean is not equal to 1 kilogram. Step 2 is to identify the alpha level or level of significance as well as the tailed test. Level of significance, if you can see at the problem, it is already directly stated that the alpha level or level of significance is equal to 0.05. Then for us to identify if it is a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test, we have to check the alternative hypothesis. So going back to the alternative hypothesis, the symbol or the mathematical symbol in the alternative hypothesis is not equal or an equal sign. So meaning to say, we have to use a two-tailed test, or this is under a two-tailed test. Then for step 3, we have to identify what statistical test are we going to use. So since the number of samples in this given problem is obviously 40 bags, and 40 bags is greater than 30, so meaning to say this problem is under one sample Z test. Step 4 is the computation. Next is to identify the given values in the given word problem. So for the first sentence, we have the 1 kilogram. So analyzing 1 kilogram refers to the parang powdered milk, 'di ba po? In general, na it is not stated na parang the sample of gantong powdered milk is equal to, 'di ba? Wala naman po. It's just stated as parang powdered milk is packed in a 1 kilogram bag. So obviously, 1 kilogram refers to the population mean. We skip the next sentence since we already know what 1 kilogram is. Next is a sample of 40 bags. So, meaning to say, all the numbers proceeding after this term will be for the sample. So, identifying what is 40 since it is stated na directly na a sample of 40 bags. So, meaning to say, 40 is the number of samples. Let's continue. Produces a mean of 0.96 kilograms. So, since this mean is still under the sentence where it explains the numerical values for the sample, automatic, this mean is the sample mean. So, our sample mean is 0.96. And a standard deviation of 0.12 kilograms. So, since the standard deviation is still under the sentence where they explain the numerical values for the sample, so meaning to say, sample standard deviation is 0.12. Now that we already have the given values, we can now decide what formula for the one sample z-test are we going to use. Is it with the one containing the sample standard deviation or the one containing the population standard deviation? So obviously, the answer is the one that contains the sample standard deviation because it is the one that is written in our given values. Substituting the given values, we will have 0.96 minus 1 all over 0.12 all over the square root of 40. After substituting, we can now get the calculator and solve for the z computed. The calculator on the left side shows you how are you going to input the values if your calculator is a 4-liner calculator. And the calculator on the right side shows you how are you going to input the values if your calculator is a two-liner calculator. The final answer for z computed is negative 2.11. Again, you have to round off the numerical value into two decimal places. Step 5 is the decision rule. Again, the decision rule for all the problems under one sample series will be reject null hypothesis if the absolute value of z computed is greater than the absolute value of z tabular. So, since we already computed for the z computed, we now have to identify the z tabular for this given problem. To identify the z-tabular, we go back to step 2 and recall the level of significance and the tail test. So since we have alpha level or level of significance as 0.05, all you have to do is draw a vertical or parang imaginary vertical line and passing through 0.05. And then since this is under a two-tail test, all you have to do is draw an imaginary horizontal line passing through two-tailed test. And the intersection of those two lines is the z-tabular for this given problem. Next is to substitute the values for the c computed, and that is negative 2.11, and the value for our z-tabular is 1.96. Step 6, we have to identify if we have to reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So for us to check if we reject null hypothesis or we fail to reject null hypothesis, let's go back to step 5 and analyze if the given inequality is true. So it says there that the absolute value of negative 2.11 is greater than or equal to 1.96. So kindly bear in mind na we are talking about absolute value. So even though we have a negative value for z computed, it is always or it will always be a positive number since all the negative numbers, if evaluated using an absolute value, it will become a positive number. So meaning to say, if we will parang simplify the given inequality, we will still have 2.11 is greater than or equal to 1.96, which is true, which is parang satisfied yung given na inequality natin. So, meaning to say, we have to reject the null hypothesis. And finally, the last step is step number 7. We have to draw conclusions from the previous steps. For the conclusion, we have the bags do not contain 1 kilogram powdered milk since we reject the null hypothesis.